Good, everyone. Welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had a further announcement from the Reserve Bank in their May monetary policy statement. They've done as expected. They've cut the official cash rate by 25 basis points down to 3.25%. That was the expected part. The less expected part was that they had to take a vote to get there. Only the second time in the Monetary Policy Committee's history that they've had to take a vote on something. It was a 5-1 split between cutting by 25 basis points and the other option being actually no change at all, which is a bit interesting, really, because I think a lot of people out in the economy looking at how much things are, struggling out there, businesses not doing all that well, might have been thinking Reserve Bank might sort of flip between the likes of a 25 and a 50 basis point cut. Instead, they were sort of saying, look, might we be done? Now, it's only a 5-1 vote, so fairly overwhelming in terms of still continuing to cut for this meeting. The Reserve Bank's forecast as well, implying there's still further interest rate cuts to come, although not that many overall. But I mean, what do you think is driving this sort of concern or question which required a vote? Because that is very unusual. Normally, the Reserve Bank seeks consensus. They couldn't get everyone over the line this time. Someone was a holdout and wanted to press pause on the interest rate cuts.
Look, I think it's a reflection of just the sheer amount of uncertainty there is out there about the economy and where things head to for both the global economy and obviously New Zealand as a result of that. I mean, the Reserve Bank did publish what was, I thought, a really comprehensive statement in terms of not just providing their central scenario, but also the central forecast, but also a couple of other scenarios around that. One whereby the tariffs and the sort of international trade war develops as a negative demand shock, so slower global growth, lower export prices, and therefore lower inflation as well. Coming through to New Zealand, and as a result of that, they potentially cut interest rates by further. They had another scenario where, in fact, it's a supply shock. Everything coming in from overseas costs more. There's still slower growth, but because of those higher costs, it means the actual monetary policy response has to be the other way because you've got more inflation coming through the system. And so who knows? Is it down the middle? Is it higher? Is it lower? Incredible amount of uncertainty there. And that is reflected, I think, both in the vote, but also in terms of the statement itself. The key thing for me, talking to the Reserve Bank since the statement came out about the vote in particular, was that the reason for sort of sitting back potentially and holding rates rather than cutting as everyone had expected was a concern, I think, from amongst the committee, or certainly amongst that particular person on there, that the Reserve Bank may have just overcooked the amount of uncertainty and the negative effects that has on the economy and inflation in its forecast. So it wasn't a case of going, oh, the world could fall to pieces. It was more a case of going, oh, okay, it's up, it's down from one day to the next, but, who knows where it'll end up. It might not end up being that bad. And given some of the other economic signals we've been getting through in terms of, gradual economic recovery, and probably more importantly, higher inflation expectations, higher inflation later this year, which is also showing through in the Reserve Bank's forecasts, there was obviously some discussion there amongst the committee that, well, what if we keep cutting now? And in fact, it turns out that some of those sort of price and demand pressures start to materialise a bit more going forward. We might have done too much, and should we just hold off and see just how bad things might be? So that was an interesting sort of response from them, and sort of just nutting through the sort of thought process around how the vote had panned out. But yeah, overall, I think the central scenario from the bank still is, like you say, scope for more interest rate cuts, although even in some of the interviews since the statement, they have been talking about, well, we may not cut much further, even though that OCR track effectively has one more cut in than they were factoring in back in their forecasts in February. So again, who really knows where things are going to? And it is very much a case, I think, of playing things by ear from here. We're still expecting another rate cut in July, and I think most forecasters would be in that camp. But, that's another 6 weeks down the track from here. And as we've seen with the global economy and events over the last couple of months, 6 weeks can feel like a lifetime.
Indeed, especially when, you look at this decision, it feels quite sensible given that uncertainty that's been profiled. Still the right move to cut, but I think also a really important signal that's come out from the Reserve Bank around that level of sort of caution. You look at some of the decisions that have been made over the last sort of couple of months or so, even back into late 2024, the Reserve Bank gave a very, very clear signal. They were like, guys, we're going to cut. And in fact, half the time they were like, we're going to cut by 50 unless something untoward happens. Very, very sort of clear easing bias. They were telling us in advance what was going to happen. Now you've got the Governor, Christian Hawkesby, who's, of course, now in instead of Adrian Orr after his departure, saying, look, we haven't got a bias for next time. We don't know if it's going to go up, down, or if it's going to stay the same. We don't have that sort of forward expectation because of just that sort of level of who knows that's coming forward. And I think that's useful because people that I talk to, you'd talk to the same, Gareth. Everyone's like, geez, need some more interest rate cuts to try and rev up the economy. But the Reserve Bank's not worried about revving up the economy directly. They care about how the economy and inflation interact. The fact that you've got inflation up at 2.5% towards the top of the target band would have been 2.6%, but for a Stats NZ error and not including something. The fact that you've got further energy price rises that are going to come forward, some of those food price increases that have emerged, and the fact that inflation expectations, although still well contained enough for the minute, they've pitched up from where they were. Households, businesses, professional forecasters all worried about it a little bit more in the system. Any other time in the economic cycle, the Reserve Bank would be raising interest rates rather than cutting. So again, fine for the minute, but does sort of raise that bigger question in the future. I mean, what did you make of the Reserve Bank's expectations for economic activity? Of course, coming just after the Treasury published their latest forecast, does sort of suggest that, again, that weaker tone coming through in the economy, even if inflation itself doesn't calm back a bit.
Yeah, I mean, what was notable about the Reserve Bank's forecast in terms of quarterly GDP growth through the course of 2025 is it was substantially weaker than they had previously been projecting, and definitely substantially weaker than Treasury's forecasts. I think what we're seeing there is a little bit of a reflection of the very long time lags between when Treasury finalises their economic forecasts and when they actually publish, because they've got to do a whole lot of fiscal forecasting based off, their economic baseline. Whereas for the Reserve Bank, it is about getting those numbers as close to the sort of final publication date as possible, rather than needing such a long lead time. So, maybe a bit of a time advantage the Reserve Bank have there, but overall, I'd say that their forecast outlook does seem to be a lot more realistic than the Treasury's one in terms of economic growth going forward. And, particularly when you factor in both of their scenarios showing whether it's a supply or demand shock, showing even slower economic growth if things turn out worse than expected, it sort of shows you, I think, effectively where the balance of risks is at the moment. On the inflation side of things, I mean, you mentioned inflation, obviously sitting at 2.6%. Reserve Bank, with their forecasts suggesting there will be less inflationary pressure under the essential scenario than previously. And I think that sort of fed through into their reasoning around the cut. It's interesting also talking to them, trying to reconcile how weak the economy has been with the fact that non-tradable inflation is still sitting at 4%, which is a bit of a dilemma for us in terms of trying to understand what's going on, for them in terms of trying to set policy. And I mean, their message was very much, they see it as being a lagged effect in terms of government charges, which slow to rise, but then, of course, they've got to catch up to everything else, which has been rising at much faster levels, of course, through 2022 and 2023. So just a bit of a recalibration of some of those relative prices. They expect that to dissipate, and as a result, they're not too concerned about inflation expectations yet. They're definitely watching them, but they are hopeful that those sort of pressures do diminish through the course of this year, and we come out the other side of it with inflation tracking down to 2 or possibly under 2%. A bit of an act of faith there at the moment, but I think it is a case of waiting and seeing how things pan out.
Reasonable at the moment, right? Because if you've been sort of seeing that things have been getting materially worse, and also, in terms of further inflation starting to press up, and the Reserve Bank, slashing and burning by 50, would start to worry you that we get back into the place that we were a couple of years ago. We ignored the start of an inflationary sort of shock coming through, and then it eventually sort of, definitely got into it quite a lot. It got stuck, and it took a little bit to dislodge. I guess the difference here is it's still sensible for the Reserve Bank to be trimming a bit. They're trying to get to around that neutral sort of position, but they're certainly, I think they're very aware of those challenges. Not red alert at the moment, but definitely that sort of orange caution light being a little bit more sort of perceived across the economy. We'll assess all of that, both the inflation outcomes, what happens to the economy, and what it all means for interest rates, and whether or not we do get a bout of at least a 2025 version of stagflation on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.